Karl Wolf is my name. I can't resist the following question. If the Korean government hires you as a consultant, what would you advise them to do, and what would you advise them not to do, based on the present dilemma we have, worldwide economic dilemma, despite the fact that the economic problems in North Korea are probably much different from the problems we have in the world? What exactly would you tell them not to do, based on our present dilemma in the world?
Well, I would try to first off persuade them that the key to their political and military security is not the maintenance of nuclear weapons. As long as they maintain a nuclear program and possibly engage in proliferation, it's going to make it simply politically difficult for most of the rest of the world to have normal relations with them in any real way. So you have to persuade them to give up the nukes. And in order to do that, and I'm not sure that's possible, frankly. I mean, I'm not sure that this is a government that has actually decided that it does have a price at which it would be willing to give up that program. But once you do that, then you have to persuade them that there will be a package of benefits that would be sufficient to induce them to undertake that action. And that certainly means things like trying to get them into the World Bank, trying to get them in the Asian Development Bank, and so on. To try to start giving them technical assistance, to help them in an internal transformation that would allow them to, as I say, start exporting manufacturers, start exporting mineral products, and earning foreign exchange and dealing with some of the underlying structural issues. There are a lot of things that they can do internally that would be useful, but that fall short of sort of signing on to the Washington consensus. And let me give you a couple examples. I mentioned the marketization of the economy that has occurred over the last 15 years or so. How did that occur? One of the things that happened was a kind of loophole or provision in North Korean practices that was designed for one purpose, was used for very different purposes, but had a very positive effect. And here's what it was. Back in the 1980s, I honestly can't remember if it was Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il, announced something called the August 3rd Movement for People's Goods. And the idea is that marginal participants in the workforce, retirees, physically handicapped people, women with young children, were going to get scrap material from the state-owned enterprises. And they were going to fabricate these scrap materials into simple consumer goods, and that those would then be sold at the county level. What happened in the 1990s as the system started falling apart? People started going to the managers of the state-owned enterprises and offering to pay them a fee to be classified as an August 3rd worker, because that meant you didn't have to come to work. So the August 3rd provision became the way, in effect, that you moved labor out of very low productivity activities in the state-owned enterprises and into this marketizing economy. But here's the rub. Where's that money going? People are paying daily fees to the SOEs for the right not to come to work. Is that money being used as working capital to set up these retail kiosks that we see, a lot of which are actually owned by state-owned enterprises? So in effect, the state-owned enterprises are going into retailing. That's one possibility. Is it being used as capital to continue operating in the nominal field that the SOE is supposed to be operating in? Is that to say it's being used for investment goods or something to continue producing tractors or whatever you're supposed to be doing? Or is it just going into the manager's pocket and his wife's buying fur coats in China? So a reformist government in North Korea, without signing on to the Washington consensus or adopting uniform flat taxes or a flat tariff or anything else, could simply build on this by making this, by essentially ratifying this, making it transparent, open. Let's see where the money is going. They could tax it, whatever. Another example. Your right to abode is contained in a certificate that you get that says that, Mark Thurwall has the right to live in this apartment. What has happened in North Korea is implicitly what has arisen is a market in apartments. So that he'll sell that certificate to somebody else. The problem is he doesn't have any property right to that apartment. And that certificate still has his name on it, even if you're living in it. So if the police come, maybe you can convince them you're really him, but we don't know. Again, a reformist government could help begin developing property rights internally and allowing people to trade. So I think there's a lot that can be done, both at the level of kind of high politics and also at the level of just building on what you've already got. And unfortunately, I don't see this regime doing much of either.
Thank you.
To what extent is it possible to say what the average North Koreans think about their regime? Do they, within their private thoughts, blindly accept what they're told, or is there private gossip about the fact that life in China and South Korea and other places is actually not as told to them by state media?
Oh, thank you so much for asking that question, because it gives me another commercial opportunity. The current edition of The Economist magazine, it has Henry Paulson on the cover, has a special insert on Korea. And on page 8 of the special insert, they begin a whole section that runs on for about 2 pages, in which they extensively cite research that Steph Haggard and I have done together with a lady in Korea named Yoonok Chang on almost exactly this topic. What we did was we interviewed more than 1,300 North Korean refugees in China. Now look, these people have voted with their feet. So it is not surprising that their views about the North Korean government are decidedly negative. Nevertheless, the results that we get from this poll are really quite interesting in a variety of ways. For example, at its peak, the World Food Program-led international effort was in principle feeding more than 1/3 of the North Korean people. More than 1/3 of consumption needs were coming through international aid. When we asked people, were you aware of this aid program, some substantial number, and don't hold me to the exact digits, but some substantial number, around 38% as I recall, had no idea what we were talking about. Now, admittedly, if you broke it down between urban residents and farmers, the percentages were higher for the farmers, and you could say, well, farmers may not have known about the food aid program because it was mainly in the urban areas, but still, substantial number had no idea this was occurring. Then when you asked the 60-some% who knew about it, we asked them the following question: do you believe that you are a beneficiary? And roughly 95% said no. Then we asked them, who do you think the main beneficiaries were? Number 1 answer, the Army. Number 2 answer, high party officials. Now, as it turns out, I'm an economist, Haggard's a political scientist, Yoonok is a psychologist by training. So she's really interested in a lot of psychological things, and asked these people a whole battery of questions, psychological questions, basically used to diagnose post-traumatic stress syndrome. It turns out that the single highest correlate with bad psychological outcomes and attitudes towards the regime is the status of having known about the food aid program but believing that you are not a beneficiary. These people are absolutely and profoundly embittered. Roughly 25% of our sample reports having lost family members during the famine, and about 10%, almost 10%, report having been incarcerated in political detention facilities. This status of knowing about aid but feeling it was denied to you in your time of need has an even more negative impact, both psychologically and in your perceptions of the regime, than even being incarcerated in the Gulag. So at least among this subgroup of people who fled, attitudes are very negative, but at the same time, there is a sense that the regime at some level still is able to control information flows in a pretty significant way. We're actually doing additional research now. That survey was done in China, and it was done under very hazardous conditions because these people are basically illegal aliens, and they're facing deportation if they're caught. And indeed, their greatest fear is being repatriated back to North Korea. We're now doing another survey in South Korea under, obviously much more calm conditions, and hopefully it's a little bit longer survey instrument, and hopefully it'll be a little cleaner. We've done a survey in China of more than 300 Chinese businesses operating in North Korea. Unfortunately, although we've done the survey, we're just beginning to analyze the data, and I haven't been able to incorporate it into this presentation. But if you keep looking at the Peterson website, eventually not only additional work on hunger issues, but some of this work on both refugees and the survey of Chinese businesses in North Korea will start popping up over the next few months.
I'm Brett Williams from University of Sydney. You didn't show us a graph about military spending. I'm just wondering what it would look like if you were to... I'm just interested to know how it's changed over the years. And secondly, I'd be interested in your opinion about how much impact the level of military spending has on the rest of the economy.
That's a very good question. It's a very hard question to answer. And the reason is that, as an economist, I can't help myself. But people always ask me, what's per capita income in North Korea? And basically I say, I don't know. I mean, it's almost not a relevant question. It is an economy that is so distorted that doing the normal national income accounts calculations that we would normally do is almost just a fool's game. On the military side, the problem is this. It is the world's most militarized society. If you count, for example, the share of males between 15 and 65 in uniform, you can derive physical measures that suggest this is the world's most militarized society. The estimates of what share of the economy go into the military, there's a very wide range, typically on the order of 25 to 40% of GDP devoted to the military. That may be a little deceptive because the North Korean military also performs duties that would typically be done in the civilian sector in most other countries. So, for example, they have construction battalions that are, doing construction work that typically a construction company would do here in Australia. So it's an extremely militarized society. The exact numbers are a little hard to tell. But beyond the exact numbers, one of the issues is that the military appears, and here this is really speculative. I mean, most everything you've heard this afternoon is speculative, but this is even more speculative. The military appears to be a very conservative organization. So not only does it get a lot of resources, it tends to weigh in on what I would consider the negative side on some internal policy debates about economic reform. So it has a kind of malevolent influence beyond its direct burdens that it places on the economy. And then finally, the issue with the military is the military has its own trading companies, it has its own captive banks, and it is possible, and the military has its own economy, essentially. It is possible that the military would like to continue, for example, some arms trading activities for purely pecuniary reasons, even if, say, the foreign ministry or other parts of the government want to stop them for broader diplomatic purposes. So the military seems to be a real problem in North Korea, and in questions about succession, if Kim Jong-il were to die, most people seem to believe that initially at least what would follow him would be some form of collective leadership emanating out of the National Defense Commission. So it's an important player in all of this, both economically and politically.
Marcus, thank you very much. Could I just follow on from that question? Many people who've been watching North Korea over the years have been watching to see an increase in that commercial activity of the KPA, because following the tradition of North Vietnam and China, they've actually been quite important players in getting the economy to the next level. But we haven't seen a lot of it other than what you've just talked about. Have you seen any visible increase in that in the last, say, 5 years or so?
I have not. And I also don't have a security clearance, and I'm not, privy to. Or actually, I may have a security clearance. I'm not sure. But in any event, I'm not privy to some of the sorts of things that the U.S. government and other governments around the world keep a close eye on. I think in some ways it's disappointing, because one of our great hopes was that essentially we could buy these guys out. And as one of my friends from the Department of Defense said, yes, unfortunately it appears that these guys are really a professional army. They're really interested in killing people. They're not interested in making color televisions. And so, there has not been, at least I haven't observed an upsurge of commercial activity. And in some ways that's not good. It may be harder to buy these guys out than we may have thought.
I had a question here, and then here.
Hi, my name is Casey Mays from the American Consulate. If famine does beset North Korea, as it looks like it might, and it is as a result in part of these government policies to seize grain in the countryside and to ban trade, is there a greater prospect this time around for a peasant uprising?
Yes. I often get versions of this question, and basically it's like, if things are so miserable, then why don't people just overthrow this government? And here's the problem. As miserable as the North Korean government is, it actually faces a situation both internally and externally that's not too bad for the maintenance of control. Internally, there is no civil society. There are no institutions other than the KPA capable of channeling mass discontent should it exist. There is no solidarity trade union as there was in Poland. There is no civic forum as there was in Czechoslovakia. There is no Catholic Church as there was in the People Power Revolt against Marcos, or in Poland, for example, legitimating dissent. This is a government that has extensive internal security services that it deploys ruthlessly. So there's basic lack of social organizations that would be capable of organizing any kind of mobilization. And then externally, it faces a paradoxically supportive environment. There are no anti-Kim Jong-il armies being organized in the Chinese border region. Quite the contrary. If anybody tried to organize such an army, in Yenji or Jilin province, the Chinese security services would cooperate with their North Korean counterparts to make sure that didn't happen. Similarly, there's no armies being organized in South Korea. For their own reasons, South Korea and China would prefer to see, if not a continuation of this particular regime, a continuation of the North Korean state. So this is not kind of, apartheid-era South Africa, where, the ANC was organizing a guerrilla army in the frontline states, or it's not even the French not being able to chase the Algerians into Tunisia. This is a government that has a complete monopoly on social control internally and a surprisingly supportive environment on its two borders. So no, I think that this is a situation in which I don't know if they could go through another arduous march, but you can inflict a lot of misery on this population and force them to endure it, I think, without profound political change. Unless Kim Jong-il dies, and then that creates, in the absence of obvious succession plans, a more fluid situation, which could go well or it could go badly. The worst case is probably if the KPA actually, the problem is now there are basically three centers of power: the family, the party, and the army. All of them have internal rivalries, and there's some evidence of coalitions across them. Probably the worst possible outcome would be, and remember, it is the world's most militarized society. Huge number of men under arms. Basically, every adult male has military training. So once shooting starts, there's a lot of capacity for mayhem in this society. And the worst possible case is if the KPA splits into factions and they actually start shooting at each other. And then one or more of those factions appeals for outside support, either from the Chinese or the South Koreans. You could have a civil war involving foreign powers in a nuclear state. And that would not be fun.
John Langdale from Macquarie Uni. Probably you really want to wait to your research process on China, but could you comment on, China's rapid economic growth is dragging exports from other Asia-Pacific countries, and its likely future growth is going to continue to do that. I wonder if you could comment, even in advance of your analysis, on what's happening to North Korea. Are they able to export minerals or other products, manufactured goods to China? I know they can import things from China if they had the money, but could you comment on the exports and economic integration?
Yeah. No, this is good. This is an Australian audience, so you'll appreciate this. A couple of years ago, I was at Jwaneng, which is the largest diamond mine in the world. It's in Botswana. And I had lunch with the management there and the head of the union. And the chief mine engineer was complaining that at shift change times, there were representatives of BHP, Rio Tinto, and all these multinational mining companies outside his gate trying to hire people. Mining engineers in Botswana could double their salaries if they signed up and came here to Australia. The guys who do specialized artisanal work on things like mechanics who work on these enormous mining machines, they could triple their salaries. So the China-driven commodity boom was so profound that it's affecting labor markets in Botswana. Okay? A couple of weeks later, I went along the length of the China-North Korea border. And what was really striking was exactly implicit in your question. This is a country that's bordering China. Even if they don't really have it together too well, they should just be being sucked along in the slipstream of China. North Korea, even if they don't have their act together, ought to be growing 5, 6, 7% a year, and they're not. Which is implicit evidence there's something really wrong internally with their inability to take advantage of these opportunities. Now, when you look at what they are able to do, a lot of what they do is, in fact, natural resource based. Here is a typical way it works. You have some steel mill in Manchuria that needs coal. Even low-grade, crummy low-grade North Korean coal will be okay. It hooks up with a Chinese business in the border region because then it can get privileged status to do border trade. There's certain Chinese tax advantages for doing this. On the other side, you have the guy who's he's the manager of tractor factory number 3, and he hasn't made a tractor in years. But he's supposed to be paying this workforce. So what he does is if he's big enough, he has legal status to do trading in China. If he's not big enough, he can do it through his ministry. But what he does is he writes down a wish list. 50 radios, 25 black and white TVs, 10 used refrigerators. And he sent his buying agent into Yenji or one of those border towns. And the market is sufficiently developed that there's actually specialized hauling firms, for example, that will provide them a small truck. They go and they collect the consumer goods. They drive it, the truck drivers will drive them across the land bridge, across the Tumen River, and then they offload the goods on the other side, on the North Korean side. I asked one of these Chinese truckers, I said, well, you don't deliver the TVs to North Korea? And literally verbatim, he looks at me and he says, are you crazy? So they'll steal my truck. So we'll collect all this stuff for you, we'll drive it across the bridge, but after that it's all yours. So then what happens is, the factory manager, he takes his workforce, they go out, and sometimes literally in wheelbarrows, load this stuff up, they haul it away, and then they go off and sell it. So I call it the Walmartization of the North Korean economy. The formerly privileged industrial proletariat is turned into the retailers of cheap Chinese consumer goods. So now how does he pay for it? He does a deal with his counterpart at the mine. So what in effect happens is mineral products and other natural resource products go up into China, and what comes back is consumer goods. And it is either monetized with the currencies of settlement being Chinese yuan or US dollars, or it's straight barter deals. But that's the basic typology of a lot of the trade that's going on now.
Sorry. Pete Bannister, New South Wales Treasury. My question follows on. Is North Korea so cut off that it's got no source of foreign advice, or are they from China? In other words, whatever advisors they have, if no Westerners go there, are their advisors Chinese?
Lots of people try to provide the North Koreans with advice. The government of Australia, for example, has attempted to run a program which I understand is now in abeyance, in which young, up-and-coming North Koreans are sent to ANU to get training in business or something. But in terms of policy advice, they get it from China. They get it from Western countries, especially like Sweden is trying to help them and so on. I think that the most interesting connection that we've really seen kind of percolating in the last year or two is their relationship with Vietnam. And I think that's important for two reasons. Number one, the North Koreans may well be more willing to listen to the Vietnamese than they are the Chinese. I mean, they have issues with China, and they're probably a little afraid of being too revealing with China and following China too closely. So in some sense, the Vietnamese may actually be less threatening to the North Koreans than the Chinese are. The second reason why it's good to talk to the Vietnamese is the North Koreans often blame their problems on hostile U.S. policies. And we can debate to what extent U.S. policy has a negative impact on the North Korean economy. I think it's generally exaggerated. Nevertheless, if you compare China and North Korea, they both suffered very similar shocks in the late 1980s with the withdrawal of Soviet support. The Chinese acted with alacrity. They adopted reform policies, and as I'm sure many of you know, Vietnam has really developed since then. North Korea really didn't seem to grasp the scale of changes going on in the world around it, and it really didn't move, and here they are now. But what's important beyond that with the comparison is the United States fought a war with Vietnam more recently than it fought a war with North Korea. The Vietnamese killed a lot more Americans than the North Koreans did. Nevertheless, the United States and Vietnam normalized diplomatic relations, and indeed we have a bilateral investment treaty with Vietnam. And we're even talking about having a free trade agreement. So the Vietnamese advice, beyond whatever technocratic advice they can give on the economy, I think would be very useful in terms of diplomatic advice about how it is you deal with the Americans. So when I see the North Koreans talking to the Vietnamese, I think that's probably a good thing.
G'day. Lou Jenkins. I'm interested to know a bit more about how effective you think restrictions on trade and foreign aid are in negotiations with the ruling parties. You mentioned that it has an effect on refugees who are crossing the border, but there's no body within the country which could facilitate some kind of revolution, people-led. But I can't imagine that they'd be at the table if there was no restrictions on trade or on aid going into the country. Is it an effective tool for keeping them at the table and trying to get them to control their nuclear activity, or is it are there other policies? How far could it be taken?
That's a good question. North Korea presents a very difficult problem for much of the rest of the world. And the reason is that this is a government that is completely unaccountable to its own people and absolutely ruthless in its pursuit of its narrow goal, its goals, very narrowly defined. And to put it bluntly, most of the time, governments like the United States or the government of Australia appear to care more about the North Korean people than the North Korean government does. And so it is a government that can adopt negotiating stances and negotiating tactics that would be impossible in a democracy or a government where there was a greater accountability. They simply couldn't get away with, in effect, threatening a second arduous march in order to pursue nuclear activities. So it is very difficult for the rest of the world to deal with the North Koreans. The United States strategy, at least during the first 4 years of the George W. Bush administration, was a strategy that in some ways made sense on paper, though it didn't make too much sense in reality. And that was this. You basically force the North Koreans to the wall, and you say to them, look, you have a choice, binary choice. You can either keep your nuclear weapons, but in that case, you're going to be cold and hungry and in the dark. Or you can forego nuclear weapons, and we will help you integrate into the global community both politically and economically in a much more favorable way than you are now. That's basically, that seems to me a pretty reasonable approach. The problem is this. Every time the United States or Japan or other countries who had tendency to pursue that kind of policy started pushing the North Koreans, when it looked like they were going to be pushed to the wall, the Chinese and the South Koreans will step in. Because ultimately, China and South Korea are more afraid of instability in North Korea than they are afraid of nuclear North Korea. So this policy of kind of pushing them to the wall, forcing them to make this fundamental choice, could never work because it suffered from such a basic collective action flaw. And so where we are today and why these things, I have a friend, for example, who, a lot of the people have been working on these problems for a number of years. They would tell you they are absolutely astonished that in 2008 we are where we're at. If you had told them in 1996, during the famine and during the enormous expansion of aid activities, that we would still be in a situation in which the North Korean government fundamentally has not accepted a paradigm that, sort of we're here with free food and we're here to help, but instead continues to put restrictions and impediments, even on humanitarian aid programs, much less development assistance or anything else, people wouldn't have believed you. So you put those two things together, the basic geopolitical point that ultimately it's North Korea's weakness, not North Korea's strength, that is most frightening to South Korea and China, together with the fact that you're dealing with a government that seems to really not care too much about what happens internally if it achieves these very narrow political military goals. It is a very formidable adversary with which to negotiate. And that, I think, is basically why these sorts of negotiations drag on for years and years and years without any real satisfactory resolution. That's not a very uplifting answer to your question. But unfortunately, I think that really is a reasonably accurate description of the basic outlines of the problem. Well, I don't think pushing them is going to work too well, although the U.S. financial sanctions seem to hit them where it hurt. That was very interesting, that a lot of this other stuff we talk about didn't seem to have much effect, but the disruption of international financial transactions with the Banco Delta Asia case really did seem to cause problems with them. It's got to be some sort of combination of carrots and sticks. You've got to have some ways of exerting pressure on them. Whether it be through proliferation security initiative activities to disrupt some of these illicit activities that I described earlier in my talk. And at the same time, you've got to give them an out. You've got to tell them that if you act cooperatively, we will help you with all this other stuff. And frankly speaking, the North Koreans look at the World Bank and they're, wait a minute, you want us to give up our nuclear weapons, which in our view maintains deterrence on the peninsula, in order for a loan program of, I don't know, a few $100 million a year? So we have to be able to generate enough carrots, either through Japanese post-colonial claims, getting into the international financial institutions, better access to the U.S. market. We've got to generate enough carrots, that there's enough carrots on the table, and the sticks we can come up with are threatening enough to push them down that road towards a nuclear disarmament. But I am not at all convinced that this is a government that's made that fundamental strategic decision yet.
It's a fairly somber note to leave it on, although not quite as somber as the prospect you were painting earlier about civil war and a nuclear state, which is particularly grim. But one of the great privileges of the Wednesday Lunch at Lowy series is getting to hear experts who are deeply knowledgeable about their subject. It's even more of a privilege when you get to hear someone who's extremely good at communicating it, and it's been a fantastic lunch, I think, today. Now, I'd like to draw things to a close, and please, could you join me in thanking Marcus for a terrific